Welcome to the Ascent at Boston Avenue podcast. I'm Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
And I'm Caitlin Drake. I use female pronouns, she, her, hers.
Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. During the 40 days of Lent, Christians are encouraged to focus on their relationship with God and on growing as disciples, students, or followers of Jesus. Spiritual practices can be an important and meaningful part of growing in relationship with God. Here at Boston Avenue, we are exploring 6 different spiritual practices that might enrich your life. Boston Avenue is providing these podcasts along with live workshops, which are offered on Sunday mornings beginning at 9 a.m. Central Time and can be attended in person or via Zoom. Contact the church for more information. Today, we are joined by Linda Alegria, who will be teaching a session titled Let It Rain, Growing in Self-Compassion. Hello, Linda.
Hi, and I will introduce myself using female pronouns, she, her, hers. Linda Alegria. Thank you.
We're so glad you're here, Linda. So your workshop is titled Let It Rain. And for those who are listening and can't see in front of them, RAIN is actually an acronym. Can you tell us where it comes from and what that acronym stands for?
Yes, I am basing this study and this practice on the work of Tara Brach, an American psychologist and Buddhist teacher. She didn't initially develop RAIN, but she refined it. And I'm using her kind of updated, refined version of RAIN. And RAIN is an acronym. The R in RAIN is just to simply recognize. The A is allow. The I is investigate. And the N is nurture.
You present RAIN as a self-compassion tool. What is self-compassion and why is it necessary?
Self-compassion, one way that I can talk about self-compassion is loving myself into healing. We all have a lot of things to heal from, a lot of wounds, a lot of hurts, a lot of what I would refer to as unskillful thinking, a lot of limiting beliefs that were formed early in childhood that still impact us. So we all have a lot of healing. And compassion is one way to love ourselves into that healing.
So this workshop is being offered as part of our spiritual practices series. And I think there are a lot of folks out there who might not immediately think of self-compassion and spiritual practice as integrated or complementary ideas. Could you help us see the connection?
I think that at the core in all of us as being created by God is love and compassion at our very core. And when we experience compassion for others, we want to do something to help the person that we see is suffering in some way and brings out our feelings of compassion. But when we have compassion for ourselves, it allows us to recognize our humanity and our sense of all of us are in this humanity thing together. So we all struggle. We all have mistakes that we make and hard things we go through. But if I have genuine compassion for myself, I recognize that I, like everyone else, needs kindness and understanding. So then I'm better able to extend that compassion to all of humanity, not just people that I agree with or feel that I have a lot of things in common with, not what I would refer to as my tribe, but to have compassion for every living thing.
Before we go through the steps of RAIN, when does it make sense to use RAIN?
Anytime you are able to notice that you are caught in thoughts and emotions that are hurtful and negative, and that happens to everybody all day long, perhaps. Anytime we can be aware, we can notice that we are feeling some kind of pain, to stop and to be able to figure out what is really going on here. What is it that I'm actually thinking? What am I actually feeling? What is manifesting in my body that tells me this is a moment of suffering?
I think that leads us really well to our next question. We're going to have you walk us through each of those steps or those parts in RAIN. So the first one, that R, is recognize. Tell us more about what that looks like, how you do that, more about that recognize component.
Yes, that is just recognizing what's going on, just consciously acknowledging in any given moment, what am I actually thinking and feeling, and what behaviors are affecting me? And this is just done very simply by just being aware, noting what you're most aware of. So then the A is, once I notice that I'm caught in some kind of negative thinking or feeling or acting, then I can just allow the experience to be just as it is without judging myself, without trying to change it. Just allowing whatever thoughts, emotions, feelings, sensations in my body, just to allow it, notice it, and not trying to fix it. Just let it be there. And then allowing creates kind of a pause that makes it possible for me to deepen my attention, because I'm not feeding the story. I'm not coming up with more and more thoughts and emotions about, say, for example, I feel hurt because of something somebody said. I can create a whole drama around that. I can go into a lot of thoughts and emotions that continue causing me to feel hurt. Or I can stop, recognize I'm hurting, allow it to be there, investigate it. And maybe by investigating, I recognize I am creating this pain and suffering because of my own thoughts and reactions, and that they're not true. That's the other thing. If we believe every thought that comes in our head, we're in trouble. We have to learn how to challenge our own thoughts. But if I do that, I create a little space because I'm stepping back, I'm detaching enough to observe myself, notice what's happening. Just that little detached space causes what's going on in me that's causing the suffering to begin dissipating, breaking up, because thoughts and emotions are like waves on the ocean. They rise, they fall, they rise, they fall. If I can just allow that and trust that if I don't feed this story, if I don't continue creating a drama, it will pass like waves on the ocean. And that allows me to come into a different awareness. That allows me to realize I can take some time to nurture myself with self-compassion. Self-compassion naturally arises in the moments that I recognize I'm suffering. And it comes into fullness when I really nurture my interior life with self-care. So, for example, let's say I've just practiced RAIN and I realized that I was feeling sad because I interpreted someone's actions as being in some way indicating they didn't care for me that much, or whatever I imagined. I realized that I am suffering because, and this is an important statement, I'm believing a lie. It's not true. I have made it up. I have created it. So I might say to myself in that recognition, sweetheart, this is a moment of suffering. Just take 3 deep breaths, relax. I'm here with you, and we're going to go through this together, and you're fine. And you are worthy of love. You deserve love. And the only thing real is love. And everything else is an illusion. So just go back to your love. That's a quick example of how that might work.
So, one of the things I love about that nurture step that you just modeled so well is that way of talking to yourself that is so gentle and so kind. And I don't think that's something that we teach or normalize just in our culture at large. So, I think that for some people, that step is really challenging. Do you have any tips or formula for that piece, especially that nurturing piece?
I'm really glad you asked me that question, Caitlin, because in my counseling work, what I'm so aware of and hear over and over are how shame based we are. And everyone, Tara Brach refers to it as the trance of unworthiness, that most of us are living in that trance. And we can be compassionate towards others, we can care about others, but not so much towards ourselves. And what I find is we have convinced ourselves over the years that perhaps we're not worthy of love. We're not worthy of tenderness. We're not worthy of kindness to ourselves because of this unworthiness. I feel ashamed. It's my fault that thus and thus happened. I should have been better. I should have done more. I should have done this or that. And we build up this feeling of unworthiness. And I know we've talked some about perfectionism and in Brene Brown's work that where there's perfectionism, shame is lurking nearby, always. So self-compassion, as you're pointing out, it's difficult for us to do because we've convinced ourselves we're just somehow not good enough. And it must be our fault. That's not how God sees us. God would never say, you should be ashamed of yourself for what you just did. No, not the God I know and trust.
I really appreciate all of this because when I go back to scripture and when I'm talking with the youth about the scripture where they ask what the greatest commandment is, and Jesus says, love Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second one is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And I always talk to the youth that we always think about the loving your neighbor part, but we skip over the loving yourself part. You need to love yourself in order to give all the love to the neighbor as well. That we can't just skip over the loving yourself aspect of that scripture.
I love
Thank
that,
you.
Philip.
Thank you, Philip. I often will tell people, clients, friends, family, whomever will listen, the first person you need to fall in love with is yourself. And I had a client who told me recently she grew up in a horribly abusive, dysfunctional home with alcoholism and drug abuse and on awful things going on. And her mother was very poor. They were very poor. Her mother was very uneducated, and there were 5 children. And it was very hard. But she remembered going to her mother one day and saying, how will I know when I find true love? How will I know true love when I see it? And she was only 9 or 10 years old. And her mother said, go look in the well. And that was so powerful because, of course, what she saw was her own reflection. So her mother is poor and uneducated and a victim of abuse, understood that we must love ourselves if we are to ever find and be able to truly love others. Because until we do, Philip, it's conditional. We say we love other people, but a lot of times what we're saying is, I love you if you behave this way and if you do this for me and you meet this need. I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about.
Relating it to our spiritual lives a little bit, one of the most profound things around self-love and self-compassion that I've heard in the context of church world in particular has been as it relates to in Genesis, where it says man was made in God's image. And that concept of you are a reflection of God. So how can that not be worthy of love, of acceptance, of care? You have that divine peace within in your creation and that God created you. So like, again, how could you not feel like you deserve love with that kind of lens? So that's love to hear it, love to talk about it. It's important stuff and can deepen us personally and spiritually in so many ways.
Yes, and one of my favorite lines from the Course in Miracles, which I study, is that a miracle is a shift in perception from fear to love. So much of our suffering comes out of our egoic identification with fear, worrying about what other people think, worrying about belonging, fitting in, being good enough. Our culture doesn't help with that because the cultural mandates go against it in a lot of ways. You are supposed to be successful by being productive, doing more, achieving, accumulating, and it doesn't support us in what really matters, perhaps. So that takes some real work to get to the true self, the God consciousness, so that we can figure out what matters and what we're here to do.
As someone who's working on my mindfulness, this strikes me as something that gets easier or more familiar, more comfortable to do with practice. Is this accurate? Do you have any tips on integrating this practice into our everyday lives?
Yes, I think that rain fits right along with mindfulness because you're taking some time to come into the present moment and just notice what's there. And I'm going to say something that might be challenged, but I really do believe this. The part of you that's able to observe yourself is your soul, because the ego has no ability to observe. The ego is not aware. The ego lives completely in the past or the future. It's never in the now. So when we become mindful, come into the present moment awareness without judgment, happiness will naturally arise because we're not trying to create false narratives around what is. We're just here in the truth of this moment. So I think mindfulness and compassion go well together because compassion arises out of mindfulness. And it's a practice, like you said, Philip. And I tell people the key to spiritual practices, the key to mindfulness, the key to transformation and evolvement and healing is practice. We have to have practices, spiritual practices that we're willing to do on a daily basis, not just when we're struggling or under stress, but to make it part of our day-to-day life. And the more you practice, the more natural it comes to you, and you begin to really see the fruits of the Spirit in your practices.
We talked about shame as a stumbling block, particularly in that nurture kind of arena, but especially in your professional experience, have you encountered some other maybe common stumbling blocks that folks run into with the RAIN practice? And any tips you might have around navigating those stumbling blocks?
Probably the biggest stumbling block is our own sort of natural resistance to doing anything differently, to especially change. We all resist change out of fear. We're afraid of the unknown. So sometimes we become so identified with our negative beliefs and our limiting beliefs and negative perceptions that we cannot imagine showing up any differently. And it feels scary and threatening to stop and really look at what is going on in this moment. So there's a natural resistance to doing it because a lot of times people have done everything they can to stay busy and distract themselves so they don't have to feel their feelings and they don't have to be aware of what's going on because it's too painful and overwhelming. So those are some examples maybe of roadblocks to doing this work.
You've mentioned limiting beliefs. Can you explain that concept a bit?
Yes, a limiting belief, and I have lots of examples, they're usually formed in childhood when we're really young. For example, the 6-year-old child that observes her alcoholic father going into rages and deciding at 6, the only way I can be safe is to try to not make any mistakes. This is where perfectionism gets set up, and be such a good little girl that daddy will stop raging and I will be safer. That's one example. Or it could be the child who decides at 7, 8, 9, 10, I can see that my parents are very dysfunctional and struggling. And so I'm going to have to step up and take care of my parents and my younger siblings. I'm going to have to be the adult here. I'm going to have to be the one that tries to keep everybody on an even keel and keep things from blowing up. So that person, you can see if you formed a belief like that, and there are hundreds and hundreds of beliefs that get formed, but when they're formed in childhood, that's how you survived whatever it was you had to survive. And they might have seemed to have worked for you. But generally, as we get older, we reach a point in life where we realize they're not really working for me. They're actually causing me problems in my relationships. And I'm going to have to form new beliefs because those are not working and they're not even true. But when you're forming beliefs as a little child, you're not completely, fully developed cognitively. You don't have the maturity or the life experience to really know things. So you just do the best you can. But unless you confront those limiting beliefs, they will sabotage you at every turn.
Thank you, Linda. I know we took you a little sideways from rain, but I know it's also all just so integrated with each other. When you start to build on one part of the self and get to know one part of the self, you unlock a little bit of a Pandora's box there.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation about the RAIN practice or about self-compassion?
I just, again, want to reiterate how important it is to practice. And it's like with meditation or breath work or yoga or any practice you might take on. At first, it doesn't feel natural. It takes time. But the more you do it, the better you get and the easier it is for you to go into the practice. So I would say don't become discouraged if you, for example, decide you want to practice RAIN, but you find that you just can't really seem to get into it. Just notice what you think might be hindering you. And what you may find is you notice your own resistance, that you don't want to challenge or change the way you think or feel. That feels too scary, too threatening. And that's the way we are. The other thing I would say is just, it's so powerful to understand how self-compassion can lead you into that unity consciousness, that non-dual reality, where you realize we're all one in the spirit, and self-compassion can take you there.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Linda. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. Our theme music was composed and performed by Wyatt Smith. Boston Avenue United Methodist Church is a progressive historic church located in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please visit our social media platforms for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue UMC. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time.